My experience of nuclear goes back quite a few years when I was instructed at a time when it appeared that nobody else was really doing nuclear work. And I was taken by the client, who can still and must still remain nameless, into a little room about a quarter of the size of this, but similar infrastructure, where I was shown a film about what was called the Windscale Pile, which was responsible for one of the first nuclear disasters we had in this country in Cumbria. And occasionally you will see, possibly on YouTube, but it's available, pictures in black and white of people pouring milk down, pouring milk away because it was contaminated through this nuclear accident. And this this little experience of mine was shortly before the Chernobyl incident in Ukraine, what was then the Soviet Union. And what it impressed upon me about nuclear work was the permanence and long-lasting nature of what was being talked about. Just take this room. We've got an audience, we have panel members. Let's say this building collapsed on us all and we were all killed. Who would mourn us, and for how long? Well, I think if you're lucky, you've probably got your kids, your mum if she's still around, and your grandkids if you're lucky. And so that would be a timeline of mourning of about 60 years, probably. Add to that, well, you'd hope there'd be a public inquiry, wouldn't you, to inquire as to how you went. But that would be quickly forgotten. The recommendations, some of them would be implemented in 20 years' time. But the footprint, the time footprint of what you'd be talking about would be short in the scheme of things. But with nuclear, when you have a nuclear accident, the timelines are infinitely greater, and I mean infinitely greater. Just go back to example, the first date you're probably taught in your history lessons, 1066. Well, after the Battle of Hastings, who goes there now? What's the problem? You can still walk on the battlefield. You can't walk on the battlefield of a nuclear incident for thousands of years. So that, for me, that's my perspective, and it was born of that first case that I had, and I think it should be all of yours too. What's that got to do with ADR? Well, I think what it does is it puts everything into a certain degree of perspective and effectively puts a jacket on what we're talking about for the next hour or 40 minutes. So have that in mind, that really we're not talking about a wind farm that collapses. Well, all right, wind farm collapses, it can be put together, a building which collapses, all sorts of other things. We're talking about something which has huge effects for generations and many generations. Now, the first person who is going to talk to you is going to be Adrian Bell, partner of CMS. I am going to introduce him just a little bit because he's one of the grander people who's turning up to address you today. He's co-head of the Infrastructure and Construction and Energy Disputes Group at CMS Cameron McKenna. So a wealth of practical experience you're about to have. He's just going to work some slides first, which we've all agreed upon, and then come and talk informally. And his perspective about why things are different and why things are important are slightly different from my starting point, but you'll see how the jacket works.
Thanks, Richard. Richard insisted I stood up, so who am I to argue with him? Well done to all of you that are still here. because you've made it to the most important and most interesting session of the day. Isn't that right, Sean? So if I can make this thing work. Next button. Ah, there you go. So why is this the most important session of the day? Well, I think Richard's already explained how nuclear can go wrong, and I think historically at least nuclear has been regarded as a bad thing. But we're going to, I think, tell you today why it's a good thing, or at least it's something that we probably need and need to get used to living with. We all know we're in a sort of energy crisis, that the world needs a significantly increased energy supply. Demand for electricity is increasing for a number of reasons. We're all being encouraged to drive electric vehicles. We're all being told about the benefits of generative AI, which means we need more data centers, which means we need more power. What you might not know at the moment is that nuclear already provides about 10% of the world's energy. And I think any sort of respectable report you read or energy study indicates that that's going to be growing at quite a considerable rate. So I think that the future of energy production and consumption will be very much dependent on nuclear and making nuclear projects work. And to make nuclear projects work, we need to make sure that we're delivering them properly and effectively. And part of that, obviously, is minimising the disputes to mean that we have a sustainable way of developing nuclear projects. And I'm not just talking about large-scale nuclear projects, 1,000-megawatt type projects that historically people will have been familiar with, and I think probably is more what Richard was talking about. I'm also talking about the newer types of nuclear production, so the SMRs, which some people may have heard of, which are small modular reactors. And these are more, as the name would suggest, modular reactors. They're things that are built in factories and can be taken to site and bolted together. They're quite easily accessible, and they're becoming very popular in the data center world as those data centers need greater source of electricity. So we're seeing nuclear in lots of different ways. So this is just sort of scene setting for you to say, why is this important? Nuclear is important. It's not something that we can just generally turn our noses up anymore. It is an important part of our infrastructure moving forward, and I think it will play, therefore, a much more important role in our arena of resolving infrastructure disputes. Now, as well as there being a growing need for nuclear, nuclear power plants, SMRs, have a number of unique characteristics. And I think when we were talking in preparation for this session, in order to understand how you can manage, resolve, avoid disputes, I think you need to know and understand more about the unique characteristics of claims that can arise in this industry themselves. Some of these are sort of generalizations. I suspect people may take issues with them, but for the sake of not taking up too much of your time today and making sure that the other panel members get a fair chance, I'm going to stick with my generalizations. And then the first one is nuclear power plants take longer than traditional projects to build. Richard talked at the outset about housing development, shopping centres. These are typically 1 or 2 year projects. With nuclear, by the time you take into account all of the consenting, the commissioning, the licensing, the regulatory aspects, you're typically looking at 6 years plus for a reasonably sized nuclear project, with delays of 2 years plus routinely occurring. So they take a long time and they're often delayed. They're bigger and technically more complex. We know they are higher risk in terms of safety, so they are technically very complex to build, and safety is of paramount importance. We need to make sure they're designed properly and they're constructed properly, and all of that specialist complex engineering it is hard to organise. There are different parties at play, different subcontractors, specialist subcontractors, suppliers, all of the interface issues with these type of players in the project all come into play, and we need to make sure that we're navigating those technical complexities. it's a heavily regulated sector. I don't profess to be an expert in nuclear regulation, but for understandable reasons, it's a heavily regulated sector, unlike, again, some more simple construction projects that we may have talked about earlier today. I've talked about the interface issues. There are many subcontractors and suppliers, much like the renewables sector. It's pretty rare you just get one person, one single point of contact coming in and doing everything for you. There's lots of different parties doing their specialist bits that all bolt together. And the way that nuclear is procured is changing at a fast pace as well. Again, I don't profess to be an expert at nuclear project procurement, but there's certainly, from what I can tell and discussions from colleagues, a move away from just looking at the traditional sort of EPC model to things that are much more complex, and those in themselves give rise to new challenges in terms of looking at claims when we're talking about split packages and how things are procured on a slightly different basis. So that's why hopefully you've all stayed today to understand why nuclear is important and the unique characteristics. And then looking at how that relates to ADR, which obviously is at the heart of why we're here today. In order to sort of be able to implement effective claim management, I think you need to understand the complexities and the special nature of nuclear projects and their characteristics. I've talked about the length it takes to build these and the capital intensity of the projects. I think it's important, again, this isn't unique to nuclear, but I think it's probably more pronounced in nuclear to have very strict project controls, and they obviously take place over a longer period of time because that's how long the project takes. You need to have regular reviews of the schedules, you need to look at having robust change control mechanisms, risk management reviews and such like. Someone picked up, I think, in the earlier session about the NEC and the early warning mechanisms that are built into the NEC. Again, in the nuclear industry, because of the long-running, complex safety, intensity nature of the projects, we need to make sure we have very robust early notification requirements and that they involve all of the parties. So where I've been talking about these interface issues, we need to make sure that's pulling in all of the parties, not just the main parties, to make sure that all of the different issues that those parties are facing are taken into account and mitigated properly. And then if claims do arise, we need to make sure that we have very complex, detailed procedures for dealing with those claims contemporaneously and making sure, to the extent possible, that we're dealing with those in a collaborative way. I think for projects of this nature, collaborative ways of dealing with the claims and the disputes is even more important than it is for some other projects because of those high safety issues and the complex nature of them. And then I think something, just introducing this sort of the other panel members, that typically we'll see, and you've talked about at length today, the escalating dispute resolution procedures. I think, again, multi-tiered approaches are really important here, but what's just, if not more important, is making sure you're not just box ticking with the early stages of those escalating DRPs. You're not just saying, okay, the senior reps have met, let's move on to the next stage. I think that what's really important is making sure that you're giving each of those stages a very serious, proper chance of success. And I think hopefully we'll tease out of what remains of the session some practical ways in which you can do that. So I'm now going to hand over to Matt. Do you want the thing over there, or are you going to stand up as well?
Yeah, it's fine. Well, good afternoon, everybody. So with doing a graveyard shift, as I call this, for presentation, it's very difficult at the moment to try and, at this point of the day where everyone's been here, particularly those that have been here all day, to keep the energy up. So one of the things I'm going to say, which hopefully everyone's going to be able to explain by the end of my presentation, and it might give someone something interesting to tell their family or their friends later on. But what has nuclear energy and turkeys got to do with one another? And if you listen throughout my whole presentation, you'll all know the answer to that. So I'll leave you on that note. So with nuclear power, it's extremely complex, it's technical, and obviously the technology continues to change. So as Adrian's already said, that creates these issues around nuclear power projects that we all see. So stating some of the obvious, but some of the other reasons that I'm going to be looking at is why projects typically have higher cost as well in proportion to what the work is actually being done. The other issues as well that commonly happen within nuclear projects is that the cost of repaying the investment and the period of time it takes to get the investment and how long it takes to generate as well is a significant investment over a longer period of time. So obviously, when we're looking at technology and the way the technology is moving forward, nuclear design has to obviously keep up pace with that, and that has to happen during the construction phase. And that ultimately leads to lots of design, construction issues, and ultimately has an impact on the construction of the project. Also, another point as well is around quality assurance. I'm going to come on to this in a little bit more detail, but quality assurance on the nuclear project is far greater, far more intense than I think we see in any other sector. And naturally, that obviously implicates on things like construction activities, but also on design activities as well. So on the left-hand side, people will see a graph, and that graph has some brighter colours on the red, and it shows beyond it some more duller colours. Now, effectively, the difference between the two is looking at what was known as the overnight effect on nuclear power costs. So this is a principle where there was a study that was undertaken by Jessica R. Loving in 2016, and a part of her study looks at historical construction costs of global nuclear reactors. And the overnight theory comes from this graph about the 3 Mile Island incident. I was going to say tragedy, but it wasn't. It actually was avoided in 1979. Now, as Richard mentioned, there has been others. So Windscale was obviously a lot closer for us in the UK, which is where Sellafield now is. So that disaster happened that incident happened back in 1957, and then we saw Chernobyl happen in 1986, and more recently Fukushima in Tokyo, which happened in 2011. So what this graph is showing is that since the incident, the cost escalated significantly, and that was really what was studied around the overnight principle. And as you can see on the right-hand side, you can see there that there was elements of normal construction materials that we would see on any project, concrete and steel in particular. And what was mapped across this was what's known as a nuclear premium. So the cost of pouring concrete on a nuclear project versus the cost of installing it on a normal infrastructure project. And what this study was showing was 23% increase was on the concrete and 41% on the structural steel. And this was done by the Electric Power Research Institute that looked at various different grades of materials. In some of their studies, they found that there were some items of construction materials that cost 50% more because of it being used on a nuclear project as opposed to being used on a normal infrastructure project. And one of the main reasons for this really was the QA and QC process, which on a nuclear project, as I said before, is more intense. And that was looked at in light of some of these instances that have happened. France also, there were some French studies as well that was also undertaken, and they were all linked back to issues around learning from Chernobyl back in 1986. Now, this has been seen all over the world. There was a decline in nuclear projects during that period of time, and we saw it within the UK, with Sizewell B was the last one to be built before we started to embark on Hinkley Point C, which is currently ongoing. So what that creates is it creates a big lull in the industry, which also means that then technology continues to move forward, but also skill sets and other issues, design requirements and everything else starts to come through. And when we look at a breakdown of a nuclear plant, this was done by the DOE, so which is a US Department of Energy. And what they did was they looked at a normal construction cost profile of a nuclear project. And as you can see on the left-hand side, if you looked at the green items, which are indirect costs, so these are engineering costs, construction management, admin overheads, etc. And then when we look at the direct costs, which are the ones in blue, you can see there that the reactor and turbine equipment make up about 15 to 20% of that overall cost. So what this is showing is that if we were to try and summarise really where the major costs are in a nuclear power plant in terms of construction, the major costs are indirects and specialist pieces of, in particular, the turbine and the reactor. And similar studies have also been undertaken as well by the Nuclear Agency as well. And again, one of their graphs is shown on the far right-hand side at the top, in which indirects were plotted against directs. And again, you can see a correlation of change over this, in particularly in 2018, you can see that by that time, the indirects are making up a significant portion of the overall cost of a nuclear build project. So when we look at things like implication of design changes, where we look at regulatory impact on a project, that obviously has a huge impact to the indirects that are being incurred, and obviously starts to spoil out in terms of overrun of cost. So just looking at some projects, in relation to, you'll notice that the first three are EPR reactors. So these are all being built by, or were built by, essentially the first one was actually built by Viva, but the other two are EDF. So many of you in the UK will be very aware of HPC, which is listed in the middle. So just working through these, OL3 was plagued with technical issues throughout its whole construction process. And as you can see, it took 14 years, it was 14 years late, and came to a total construction cost in the end of 12 billion, and that one is now operational. So the cost per kilowatt is coming out about $7,000 per kilowatt. Now, just in terms of context, there were some studies in the US that were saying before 3 Mile Island, and these are inflation reflected, certainly to 2010, it was coming out about 1,000. So it's a 7 times increase to what nuclear power was being built within the US prior to 3 Mile Island back in 1976. So Flamanville as well, next one. This one was built 12 years late. It was $10 billion over budget. Suffered again with significant delays, particularly around welding and concrete issues, which had a massive impact on the overall project. And it also continued to suffer similar issues to what OL3 had. And again, different regulatory bodies. So with OL3, it was STUC, which is the Finnish regulatory team, which which were heavily involved in the regulatory side of this, whereas Flamanville was obviously under the French regulatory systems. So again, different regulatory teams, but ultimately suffered with similar technical issues. Now, HPC, many of you, certainly in the UK, will read quite a bit around this. And there was a famous quote which was set out at the time when this project was set out, which said that UK consumers will be cooking their Christmas turkeys on power by the station by 2017. So that was the strapline that was given by the plant owner at the time of starting this project. And as we've seen recently, even in the newspaper, that's now slipped to 2027, and there's now even estimates that are now saying that would now be projected to 2031. And as one commentary put, the turkeys would have died of natural causes by the time this project finishes. So that's not my quote, by the way, just to be clear. But yes, it continues to suffer with delays. The EPR reactor design as well, which is on Hinkley, and EDF are now looking at currently the development of their EPR2 design as well for future stations. Now the last two as well, the US projects, these are 2 US projects that were started with Westinghouse. These were the APR 1000 reactors. Now the first one, it was actually abandoned in 2017 because of Westinghouse going into administration. At that point, the project was predicted to be 9 billion, but at that time they had predicted that it was coming to a total cost at that point 25 billion and counting. Westinghouse filed for bankruptcy in 2017, and subsequently the project's been abandoned. Now the one on the far right, Georgia, this one did actually end up getting completed, or is being completed by Bechtel. So Bechtel actually came in and picked this one up back in 2017. Now, both of these projects have suffered significant lawsuits within the US, particularly Virgil, where there's been allegations of fraud, mismanagement. The taxpayer is estimated to still be paying 2.3 billion for this failed project, and they think it would take over 15 years to recoup that from the federal funds. So when nuclear goes wrong, I think what we're seeing here really is that in terms of quantum, it goes significantly wrong. So what's all this got to do with ADR? Well, I suppose really my thoughts really around this and my experience of nuclear is that, and I think Adrian's already said this, that relationships on the project become extremely important. One of the things we've seen with Hinkley is being contracted largely on NEC3. I know there's some FIDIC contracts and others, but it's largely using an NEC3 contract, and that was done more to incorporate collaboration and approach around using existing supply chains and new supply chains in what was the first, or is the first nuclear project to be built in this country for many decades. That in itself has seen challenges with supply chains, with specialists, particularly within the specialist side where nuclear power is heavily reliant on that. And obviously is required on delivery of its teams. And I think that's also been seen as well in my experience, even in the operational side and decommissioning side, of where that you have a limited number of suppliers that can do certain elements of work. You are beholden to them to perform as part of your team. And ultimately, the pressure becomes really around delivery and how you deliver that. So how does ADR function within that context becomes quite difficult, particularly in my experience where working with most plant owners around nuclear, there was a real reluctance to use any sort of form of ADR. And the reason why is because they don't want the contentious nature, they don't want the possibility of entering into an area of where the relationships fundamentally break down. And I think a famous quote that I've always been quoted by people when from companies when they are building this is, we don't do disputes, because we need to build the project, we need to complete the project. And as you can see, the overrun cost is extremely huge, given the level of indirect cost that's also part of that as well. So I think on that note, that was my bit.
Well, that's a perfect segue now to Matt. Sorry, Matt. Yes, to Seamus, sorry. To Seamus, who's going to get more down into the nitty-gritty of what we're talking about with disputes and mechanisms of ADR.
Okay, Richard, thank you, and thank you everybody else. Obviously we're discussing nuclear and the power sectors. We've concentrated quite a lot on the nuclear side, which I think quite rightly. So we have gone over a bit of old ground, so I've been wiping out here as I'm going along. But I just want to go back to the importance of power, because it's been said that global demand is expected to more than double from 25,000 terawatt hours in 2023 to between 52,000 and 71,000 terawatt hours by 2050. So obviously we need ways and means of getting energy. This is mainly driven in the growth in the population of the world, the economy, and rapid urbanization. In fact, it's said that every 4 months there's a city the size of Shanghai put on this planet. So it is an issue that needs to be dealt with. Electricity demand growth has outpaced growth in final energy demand for many years. Reasons being transportation, we're all moving to electric cars, space cooling, the world's getting warmer. We also have large appliances that need to be done. ICT, data centres, they just hoover up energy. So we need situations. But one thing we also need to look at is, it's all great having these power centres, but you also need the network to distribute all this. So there is an actual massive element here that needs to be considered as well. It's not just about the power input. And it's the power sectors. So yes, we're looking at nuclear, but we also need to look at fossil fuels. Because we look in the world as to where this demand is coming from. It's coming from quite a lot of emerging economies, Southeast Asia, and whilst all nuclear technology and so on, but there's a lot of fossil fuels coming on board as well, so we need to make sure we don't forget about those. Now, I was going to talk about the characteristics of power projects, but I don't want to keep everybody. I don't want to A, repeat myself, and B, I don't want to keep people away from their drinks. But what I am going to say is, why do issues arise? Because fundamentally it's about alternative dispute resolution. So there has to be a dispute that needs to be resolved. So as we've said before, nuclear energy is safety is paramount, because the half-lives of these things go on for thousands of years. So it's not as if you can just hopefully this building doesn't fall down. But if it does, I'm nearest the door, so I'll get out. But the main thing really is that you don't get a second chance, so things need to be done. So I'm just going to put down the reasons why. So you've got a detailed licensing and mainly regulatory regime, and the common issues with that becomes delayed approvals or extended and repeated approval cycles, because the regulatory authorities they have basically carte blanche to make sure that everything is correct. So you also have additional or revised requirements during the approval process, because emerging technologies are coming along, they may need to tweak various situations. Additional testing required to demonstrate the quality of components, materials, the imposition of different ways of working during manufacture, construction, commissioning, and then the imposition of changes to the power plant design as a precondition. So it's a movable feast. So yes, you might start out with a design, but there may be some refinements. So it's a very complex situation, and that in itself arises and causes many elements and opportunities for conflict. There's also the risk, risks of working in the nuclear environment. It's not like typically if you're building a portal frame and all of a sudden you have an issue and you had a welder set up to do something here, and then that person can go over there. Nuclear industry doesn't work that way because, again, it's the safety imperative. Everything has to be set out in a logical way. So if you have something that can't be done there, it has massive implications because that ability to mitigate, it gets lost in the nuclear. There's also, again, a limited ability to manage the internal processes because, again, you're working for a contracting organisation, building a shopping centre. You can do your own progress and you can take on board a bit of risk. You can't do that in nuclear. It's got to be done by the book. The regulator tells you what has to be done. Safety paramount again. This one here I think is quite important because earlier on we're talking about all these nuclear power plants, but in probably the last 2 decades, there haven't been a whole lot of them built, definitely in the UK. So a lot of people who did build them and learnt all the issues and the skill set, they're all gone. So we're now actually introducing in the power plants new people. There's a skills deficit. So again, that's another massive issue because people may not fully understand what exactly they're getting into because they haven't done it before. Size again could be underestimated. It's one of these situations. These projects are giga projects. They're massive. They've long-term implications, so people don't understand it. There's also an issue with change of procurement structures because ideally, back in the day, a lot of these were done by EPC contractors on that basis, a contracting strategy. But now participants aren't willing to undertake that or the risk. So again, that's another potential risk that leads to disputes. Again, complex and sometimes new technology, so issues. Very low tolerance of defects, so it's not like you pour a bit of concrete and the face comes off and say, oh, we'll get away, we'll rub it down. You just can't do that. Safety. And then you have the usual plethora of issues about payment issues, variation disputes. Okay, so that's really, and again, a real quick list of the main issues as to why disputes arise, safety being paramount. Okay, quite quickly, multi-tier dispute, because if you're going to have to work on a project which can last 6 to 10 years or 14 or whatever, best that you do it in a process of collaboration because you can be pretty damn sure that something will happen. And it's bad enough that you've got to sit down and work with someone for a year, but you've got to do it 11 years and the atmosphere is dreadful. So typically you'll see senior executive negotiation, might see a bit of mediation, expert determination, which Sean was saying, that's quite helpful for technical matters. It might help to clear the atmosphere as well. And then we have DAAB, boards, and then arbitration. Okay, so that's kind of typically what you might see, depending on the contract, but obviously it's up to the parties to decide. Now, what I'm now just going to outline here is I'm just going to assume it's all gone completely wrong, parties can't manage to settle this, so it's gone to arbitration. So I'm just going to make some comments here which, given the size of nuclear giga projects, I think are quite helpful and reminders maybe for people entering into it because they've slightly different characteristics. First thing is obviously the scale of the project and the potential issues in dispute. Because as I said, a project can last 6 to 10 years. So what you might have is if you have a dispute in year one about maybe some potential interpretation of something, that could fester for the duration of the project. So when you're sitting at that, you're sitting down looking and you've now got to think about, well, who's going to be a fact witness on this? Who's going to be the experts? Who are going to be the arbitrators? So you've got to sit down and think about these actual things as they're going along. You've also got to think about if you have thousands of engineers involved in various stages and participants, there's lots and lots of records. So you've got to ask yourself, how am I going to marshal all these records? How am I going to ensure that these records, yes, I've collected them, but how am I going to use them? So you've got to really put a lot of thought into the insight and insight into how you'll deal with these things, because these things will happen. I mean, Adrian made the point about claim management. I mean, claim management is absolutely a brilliant process, and I think it really helps to bring a lot of focus to disputes, because it washes away, or should I say, it brings to light a lot of issues that people can say stuff, but if you don't have the documentation, it kind of falls away. So claim management is really, really important. Okay, then it has been said now that the traditional methods of analysing delays in gigaprojects are which you're basically undertaking in a linear way, aren't applicable to the likes of nuclear projects, because nuclear projects are essentially they're dynamic. Things change. You can have 100,000 in a phase on a project. You can have 100,000 schedule or line schedule with various logic links, but that won't capture it all. So it has been said that, and I'll just read this. It's been said, this is in relation to delay. An expert who adopts a very schedule-based approach to delay analysis will quickly find themselves struggling to provide a meaningful opinion. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on there, so you need to understand that and be able to articulate that is a dynamic situation. So most scheduling software used in construction projects and by delay experts models projects on a linear basis. This is broadly representative of how a simple project responds to change in delay. However, major gigaprojects, and in particular a project as complex as a nuclear power plant, does not respond to change in delay in a linear fashion. It responds dynamically. Okay, the same is true obviously with productivity and cost. And that's why, and I think in OL3, you end up getting what's known as system dynamics, where you get, some people refer to as the black box, but you can actually model all these things. So that's why when it all gets quite complex, I think in ADR, tribunals and participants have to be a bit more open-minded about it, because all this sort of stuff just blows a lot of people's minds. So that's quite a thing. And then also another aspect is sampling and the extrapolation. Typically you might see in again, not as complex a project, you would see a party, particularly the contractor, would advance a claim on the basis of well, here's a list of claims we have, and we've taken a few of them out, and this is representative of the type of claims. But the problem you have with that is they'll look at one or two claims, they'll probably get some fact witnesses, they might get some experts in to say, yes, it is representative of what it all. However, when you actually look at it, it's quite easy with the other side to say, well, actually, they're not. The sample is unrepresentative. So if you're involved in a really complex, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a nuclear project, but best to get engage an expert statistician who will actually say, yes, we've picked these and they're representative of what's going on. Because in the nuclear industry, nuclear dispute, you could have thousands and thousands of particular issues that, so you need to be able to ensure that when you put something forward to a tribunal, that there's something there that they can understand, and they can say, yeah, that sample is representative, because quite often, so you need to invest the time and money, and quite often it's not done because either you don't have the time or the money. But in nuclear, the sort of figures we're talking, you'll definitely want to spend the money, because if you don't get it right, there's a substantial amount of downside. Next issue is export regulations. Nuclear technology can be the centre of a construction dispute, which claims for additional time and money. And when you're doing that, there's a need to comply with domestic and international regulations concerning the transfer of nuclear technology. So it's not like a bit of render. A lot of this is proprietary information that can't get out into the public domain. So you need to ensure that. Just moving on, again, the security issues, because every facility will need to be both safe from physical and cyber attack. So you need to think about how is that information going to be marshalled in relation to the participants, be it the tribunal, the council, the experts. That's something you have to consider. Lessons learned, which is something that I kind of learned, was when these things happen, nuclear projects, and they go along, the participants will, there's transparency in the process because there'll be lessons learned. So if you're a council, it might well be possible that your own clients, experts, are writing a paper on what's gone wrong for the greater good. So you want to be pretty careful that your own side is ensuring that you're not contradicting what's going on. And the last one I want to make on this one is the ability of the parties to select the arbitral tribunal members with relevant and specific experience is a key piece in achieving a successful resolution. And I say that because when you start getting into nuclear disputes or anything real technical, especially something involving licensing and regulation, you're into a minefield. So you need to ensure that people who are deciding on this have some sort of an idea. So that's really a real whistle stop on what I want to say about ADR. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Just picking up one point on a statistician. When you're dealing with sampling in any ADR or any arbitration, it's very important to have a statistician because it's counterintuitive. Statistics is very often counterintuitive. Now, Edward is the last one. We don't have much time, so I'm going to ask him to concentrate on one aspect of what he has come prepared to do. So 2 out of the 3 things he's come prepared to do, he may have to drop because of time. What I'd like you to deal with, if possible, is the supply chain management.
Okay, well, I'll do what anyone does when a judge asks them to concentrate on something, just ignore it and carry on as I was going to do. I will look at that because one of the things, Matthew, you said is, this expression, we don't do disputes. Because of the relationship, because of the difficulties, but very much we do have disputes within Hinkley Point C, for example. And the supply chain, there's over 300 key members of the supply chain, and there's interfaces between them, and there will be disputes there, which will be much more manageable and much more bread and butter disputes to us. We've heard a lot about what makes nuclear different. I won't go over it again, but one thing I was intrigued at was in that project, they discovered at one point that someone had bent a rebar on site, so it didn't come delivered just exactly as it should. Some steel fixer amended it, and whenever that was discovered to whenever the issue was resolved took 6 months, because the worry was that whatever way it had been bent could have negatively impacted on the steel. And that's the sort of thing that's going on here because of quality being so high. We have to be so careful this thing's built right. And if you think of your triangle, where you have quality, price, and time, it's all up here. It's all about quality. And I would argue the next most important aspect is time. And really, money starts to drop out of it. So that's why you get expressions. I believe we don't do disputes. Money doesn't actually matter, really, whenever we're building these things. It's about quality, and then the next thing it is about time. And we've talked a lot about the tiered dispute resolution process. So yeah, ultimately, if we have a dispute, we're going to end up in some form of arbitration for various reasons, partly because we're dealing with international contractors, and although we may believe and rightfully believe that our judiciary are totally independent from the state, that's not the same in every country. And therefore, you want to have some confidence that if we have a dispute, that the tribunal is going to be independent. And I think we can say that here, but we certainly can't say it in everywhere. So arbitration is likely. But due to the length of time, we can't just have arbitration, we need to have some form of ADR. So we talk about this tiered approach. I always roll my eyes when I see the party representatives. Senior people from each company will meet to discuss Well, if we have to write that into a contract, we're rightly in the shit, aren't we? Surely to God, senior representatives from parties know they have to discuss to see if they can resolve a dispute. Why do we have to write that into a contract? The engineer's decision, not everyone maybe will be familiar with it, but under the old ICE contract, we used to ask for an engineer's clause 66 decision. And that was because the people doing the everyday certification process and assessment of any entitlement to extension of time would have been at this level. But the engineer with a capital E was a very senior person. And what that allowed was the contractor or the employer to say, hang on a minute, this is serious. We don't accept this valuation. We want the engineer to make a decision. And it was nearly like firing a shot across the bows. This is serious. We have to do this before we take you to court or take you to arbitration. So I think it does have a value. And I started out life as an engineer, and my boss was an old school engineer with a capital E. And on a job I was on site inspecting some steelwork, and the client came onto site in an absolute rage because my boss had certified quite a large amount of money to the contractor in relation to an extension of time claim. So I went back to the office and I said, Mr. Stockham, you're going to have to phone the client. He's not very happy. And my boss, Mr. Stockham, phoned the client and said, I will tell you how much to pay. All you have to do is write the effing check. And that was the old school engineer approach. Now, Marianne was suggesting that it's more difficult now, and I think it is. I think it's more difficult for any professional to be truly independent and say, I don't care who's paying me. I will decide this. But that, I still think there's some merit in that. But what we really need is some sort of process that can deal with disputes on the fly. And because I said quality is the most important, next comes time. Why don't we effectively have a resident dispute resolver? And that's approaching towards the DAB type model. And in fact, you know, judges are retiring earlier now. I think it's necessary for judges to retire at certain ages. So perhaps we can take retired judges and set them up in a porta cabin on site. So that's a... But really, whatever that process is, whether it's a standing adjudicator or a DAB or an ad hoc process or a standing conciliator or mediator, the cost of it is immaterial. So don't worry about the cost. Don't worry about how much this is going to cost. The cost of 1 day of a nuclear project being late is vastly greater than whatever cost that process is going to be. And lastly, Richard, if you just 1 minute, we haven't talked about power, and power was up there. It's largely similar, but one thing that's changed with power, and when I'm talking about power, I'm talking about distribution, I'm talking about substations and so on, not the generation. One of the things that's changed over the last number of years is there's been a total about-face in terms of who has the whip, if you like. It used to be the employer, and the employer would say, these are my terms and conditions, and if you want to work for me, you will comply with these. Not now. It's now the market, because there isn't enough suppliers out there to fulfill the market. Marianne said it, they're picking their clients. They're deciding who to work for. And I know that substation suppliers, I know that overhead line people are picking the clients they're prepared to work for. Which utility will I work for? And the ones that have a bad reputation or try to impose onerous conditions, they won't work for them. So it's changed around. We have to play, as employers, we have to play nice. And that includes the dispute resolution process. And I'll just leave you with this, that as a party representative, the largest adjudication we ever were instructed in relation to was 120 million in relation to an interconnector. And I was quite happy to be appointed as a representative on this dispute. It's settled, unfortunately, but we were brought into it, and I said, well, the first thing we need to do is start talking and we should talk to the contractor about who our adjudicator should be. And the client said, we've already decided on the adjudicator. And I said, oh, who? They said it came down to two. One of them is a name, if I mentioned it, you would all know, very well respected engineering adjudicator. And the other one I'd never heard of. And I said, I need to go and look at this person up. Came back and said, this person, they're not even on the ICE list or the IEE list or whatever as an adjudicator. No, he's never actually done one before. I says, well, why the hell have you picked him? He says his hourly rate was slightly cheaper on a £120 million pound dispute.